All right, guys, welcome to Question of Strength. Today, before we get to your questions, because this is mostly a Q&A show, if you want to call it that, or podcast. So obviously, if you have any questions related to training, nutrition, supplementation, or whatever, just post them in the chat section of this live video. The more good questions I have, the more interesting this is going to be for all of us. Otherwise, it's just going to be me making stuff up. So if you want to make this a great experience, please share your questions. Also, I do have some questions on tap in case you lack imagination, but hopefully, with what I've seen the past few weeks, you guys have full of good questions. Hopefully, it continues this week. Now, one topic I want to brush on before we get on with our questions and answers segment is intermittent fasting. The reason why I want to talk about it is, well, first, because it's trendy. A lot of people are asking about intermittent fasting. A lot of people are claiming to do intermittent fasting, even though they really aren't. And it basically leads to many false beliefs and hopes when it comes to intermittent fasting. So I want to explain what it really is, what it can and what it cannot do, and for whom would it be an appropriate way of structuring your nutrition. Because intermittent fasting is not a diet, okay? A diet would be something that gives you, let's say, a recommended macronutrients ratio, for example, or a certain number of foods that you can or cannot eat. So, for example, veganism, obviously, you only eat veggies and vegetable and so on and so forth, fruits and stuff like that. Whereas if you're carnivore, you only eat meat. If you are on a zone diet, then it's 40% protein, 30% carbohydrates, 30% fat. If you are on a keto diet, you need to avoid most carbohydrates, staying at under or roughly 50 grams or less per day, and so on and so forth. Whereas with intermittent fasting, you can basically eat any types of diet, any type of diet you want. You can do intermittent fasting with keto, intermittent fasting with veganism, intermittent fasting with carnivore diet. It's really more of an eating pattern, which means that you change the way you structure your meals compared to what would be called a more traditional way of eating, which would be between 3 and 6 meals per day, spread pretty much equally during the working hours. Whereas with intermittent fasting, you would compress that eating period in a very short window, and the rest of the day or night would be done fasted or without food. Now, most literature on intermittent fasting talk about the 16 hours fasting window as the where it starts to be very effective. So basically, you need to be fasted for 16 hours for intermittent fasting to work its magic, or supposed magic, right? That basically leaves you with 8 hours where you can be fed. Now, the first misconception about intermittent fasting comes from misunderstanding about what being fed and what being fasted means. Being fasted does not mean you're not eating, okay? It means that you have no nutrients available either in the stomach or bloodstream. So basically, what you have eaten before has been fully absorbed. So, for example, if I'm eating a meal at 6 p.m., at 6:01, when I'm done with my meal, I'm not fasted. In fact, at 7, I'm not fasted. I'm still digesting and absorbing that meal. Again, depending on the size and content of that meal, the digestion and absorption process could take anywhere between 1 hour to 6 hours. And that's where the first issue comes when people, instead of being fasted for 16 hours, they are not eating for 16 hours. So in reality, depending on how much the food they were eating or what kind of food, they think they're being fasted for 16 hours. In reality, they could be fasted for only 10 hours or 9 hours. And that would obviously make that a lot less effective, or not even intermittent fasting for its own sake. Now, another issue is that people, they will put the fasted period when it's convenient for them, disregarding the physiological and cyclical nature of intermittent fasting. True intermittent fasting is designed to follow the human biorhythm or daily cycle, which means that you are active during the day, in that portion of the day, you would not go with food because food can actually be sedative. So you would be fasted while you're being physically active, and then you would be feeding yourself when you are entering that rest and recover mode. For example, the best example of a true intermittent fasting approach is the Warrior's Diet by Ari Hofmeckler, which recommended one big meal per day, sometimes two, and it was consumed after sundown, or roughly at 6 p.m., depending on where you are. And why is that important? Because the time of day or night where you spend most of the time being fasted has a very strong impact on how effective that approach would be for fat loss, for autophagy, for longevity, and stuff like that. The reason is that the most of the benefits that occur from intermittent fasting come from an enzyme called AMPK. And AMPK will be released when you are in need of mobilizing stored energy. Okay, so if you are physically active while you're being fasted, then you will create a much larger need for energy mobilization. So you increase AMPK a lot more. That will obviously lead to more fat loss, but also more autophagy and more benefit when it comes to intermittent fasting. Now, what most people are doing is that they are taking an easy way out and thinking or deluding themselves into thinking that they are doing intermittent fasting. So typically they will start, their eating window would start at something like 11 a.m. and would stop at something like 6 p.m. That gives them like 7-8 hours of a feeding window, which in theory does respect the 8 hours, 16 hours. We know it's not true because eating requires digestion. So if they stop eating at 6, they're probably not fasted until 9 or something like that. So right off the bat, it's kind of a iffy situation. But you know what we call someone who only eats from 11 a.m. to 6 p.m.? It's called someone who skips breakfast. It's something that people have been doing for decades, for years, with no magical benefits. Okay, it's not intermittent fasting because most of the fasted time will be spent when you are sleeping. Let's say that your last meal is at 6, so it's not fully digested at least before 9, maybe later. If you go to bed at, let's say, 10, that gives you 1 hour of being fasted while being awake. Then you sleep, let's say, from 10 to, let's say, 7 a.m. So you wake up at 7 a.m. So from 7 to 11, you are fasted. So that gives you 4 hours. So you have 5 hours where you're actually fasted while awake. So that gives you a lot smaller amount of effective fasting time. Fasting time is best done when you are in awake and physically active if you want the most benefit. So eating from 11 to 6 might be time compressed eating, but it's not intermittent fasting and does not yield the same benefits. So that's the first mistake. True intermittent fasting, if you want all the benefits, is you basically don't eat from sunset from sunset to sundown. When you're physically active, when you're going on with your day, you don't eat. You can drink, obviously, but non-caloric beverages. And when you go home and you at 6 or so, then you have your meal or meals. Okay, so that would be true intermittent fasting, because if you wake up at 7 and your first meal is at 6, you have at least 11 hours of being fasted while being physically active. Compare that to 5 with the previous strategy, which is at least twice as effective. Second mistake people make when they do intermittent fasting is that they use intermittent fasting, and I must confess, that's what I did the first time I used the Warrior's Diet. I was coming up from a bodybuilding competition where I was like super lean and very muscular, and but I was sick and tired of dieting because I had been dieting for 6 months for that show. That's a crazy story. Anyway, so 6 weeks of really hardcore dieting, and I wanted to stay lean and muscular, but I wanted to enjoy life and enjoy food because I'm kind of like a binge eater. So I figured, well, intermittent fasting, I just came out on T Nation with the Warrior's Diet. uh, offered me a way of doing that. So at first, I started with good intentions. So I was following Ari Offmeckler's recommendations of when you start your meal, you start with protein foods, so clean protein foods, then you eat your veggies, then you eat fruits if you want, and if you're still hungry, then you can have, let's say, ice cream or whatever. I started out that way. But eventually, the binger in me took over, and I was basically eating crap for the whole feeding window, and I was downing a protein shake to feel good about not having protein for the rest of the food. And that's what I find most people are looking for when it comes to intermittent fasting. They're looking for a green light, a way of eating that would give them a green light to eat all the crap they want. Now, remember what I said earlier: intermittent fasting is not a diet. It's a structure. It's a schedule of eating. Now, if you eat all kinds of crap, whether it's compressed or it's throughout the day, it still has the same negative impact on your body. And if you eat tons of crap after that fasted window, you can absolutely store body fat, and not even mentioning the negative health effect that comes from eating crap. And not only that, it reinforces poor behavior and relationship with foods, because basically you're every time you will eat, you will make it worse. You will eat more crap, you will eat more crap, and so on and so forth, because you're opening in your mind, it's okay. You will have no side effect from eating that crap. So you just eat more and more and more and more. And it just leads to a poor relationship with food, which is I'm going to deprive myself so I can eat whatever I want. And that might work on the short term, but it's going to backfire very easily. First, for your health, it's not good. And the moment you stop intermittent fasting, you go back to a more regular eating schedule. You still have that program in your mind, and you just crave crappy food all the time. So now, intermittent fasting is not something or strategy I would recommend most of the time. Only some people can do it successfully. First, if you have a stressful lifestyle, it might not be the way of doing things. Although it might seem logical to do it, because let's say you're someone who works a lot, you're always on the go, then not eating during the day makes sense, because you know what? I'm always doing something, I don't have time to eat. The problem is that the more stressed out you are, the more cortisol you produce right from the start. And intermittent fasting itself lead to very high cortisol level. The reason is that one of the functions of cortisol is to mobilize stored energy. Okay, cortisol is not a fat gain hormone; it's a fat loss hormone. It becomes a fat gain hormone when it's chronically elevated, not directly, but by its impact on metabolic rate and thyroid hormone and insulin sensitivity. But by itself, cortisol, when it's released, its job is to empty or to release glucose stored from the muscle, release fatty acid stored from the adipocytes, but also break down muscle tissue to produce energy. So one of the functions of cortisol is to make sure you don't lack energy when you're facing a stressful situation. So if you're not eating during the whole day, you will constantly be releasing cortisol to mobilize stored energy. If on top of that, you have a very stressful lifestyle, you bombard your body with even more cortisol. And that leads to a high level of adrenaline, which can actually make you feel good at first, but can really strongly backfire. That's the illusion of intermittent fasting. When you do it at first, you do, wow, I can't believe I have so much energy from not eating. Well, the reason why you have so much energy is because of the cortisol being released, and cortisol in the brain increases the level of adrenaline. It increases the conversion of noradrenaline into adrenaline, giving you that sense of energy. Okay, but it's just because you're amping yourself up. The problem is that when you spend like 10, 12 hours in high adrenaline state, you can make your own receptors, the beta-adrenergic receptors, resistant to your own adrenaline because it's constantly being bombarded. So by making yourself desensitized to your own adrenaline, eventually you go from having tons of energy to I can't get energy regardless of what I'm doing. You just don't respond to your own adrenaline, and then you crash and burn. You feel like you're like in a clinical depression state. Okay, that's the downside of the intermittent fasting while you live a stressful lifestyle. I also don't really believe in intermittent fasting as a main eating strategy, especially if you're interested in building muscle. I've used intermittent fasting quite a bit. I've used it for months at a time. I've been using it since 2003. I still use it from time to time. I've never been able to build muscle while intermittent fasting. I mean, there's just no way if you spend 16 hours without nutrients in your body, especially protein, that you can maximize muscle growth. Yeah, you get more protein at the end, but it's never enough to compensate for the 16, 18 hours of catabolism that you have, even if you have a big spark in protein synthesis at the end. It's just not optimal to build muscle. It can work to maintain muscle mass, but I've not seen it work for building muscle myself. Okay, I'm not saying it's not possible. I just haven't been able to do it myself. Uh, but it's a strategy that can be used for the short term. For example, if I'm giving a seminar and I want my brain to be amped up, then I don't eat. When I give a seminar, I don't eat because I want my adrenaline as high as possible to be the best version of myself as possible. So that would be an example. If you are traveling, maybe you are, instead of eating crappy airport food, you might be intermittent fasting for the duration of the transit. Also, when you are in a plane, the digestive process is weakened, so eating tons of food might not be a good idea. So that would be an example. You can also use it as a short-term fat loss strategy, like let's say a week or two, that could work. But I wouldn't use it as a constant strategy, something that you eat the way you eat all the time. One good strategy I've used intermittent fasting with, you can actually read it on T Nation by going to the search engine and look for Primer 52. So that's Primer 52. It's a diet I designed, and a diet and training structure to include 2 intermittent fasting days per week. That has the benefit of increasing NPK, getting some longevity, pro longevity impact, giving you the caloric restriction that might help you lose fat without having to restrict calories on the other days. And obviously the training structures go with it. So I would never like do a hardcore lifting workout when I'm fasting. I prefer to do cardio and maybe mobility work. Go read Primer 52 is a pretty good read, regardless of if you want to do intermittent fasting or not. See if you guys have been active, and it seems. All right. So first question from Bob, which is a regular. So I always happy to see you because you always have good questions. Is being jacked while being weak a sign of someone on PEDs? The guy at my gym seems to never get within five reps of failure, and I've never seen him lift more than 135 on anything. Well, 135 on wrist curl would be pretty impressive. On bench, not so much. All right. Yeah, it can be, although training style matters a lot. Some people just don't like lifting heavy. And you can absolutely get muscle growth without focusing on heavy weights. Uh, you get that by accumulating enough effective repetitions. Obviously, if he's not within 5 reps of failure, that would be a problem. But again, you're not in his body. So maybe what to you looks like 5 reps short of failure might be 2 reps short of failure in reality. Maybe he's someone who go from like easy to not possible in one shot. That can actually happen. I've seen myself. I'm kind of like that. My let's say next to last rep oftentimes looks very easy, and the next one I just die. Okay, so that could be the case of that. It could be the case of he trains in a style that just leads to a lot of local growth factors. So time under tension in the 40 to 70-second range will yield a lot of lactate, which would transfer into releasing growth factors like IGF-1, mechanical growth factors, some GH, which can have a mild hypertrophy stimulus, meaning it can help you gain muscle without having to lift heavy or even to failure if that for that regard. So my question is, would be first, I would need to look at his training. But if someone is training in a normal way and he is very big but not strong, it could indicate PEDs. Then again, it could just be genetic predisposition. Some people just have weak neurological impulses, so they might have muscle mass, but they're not efficient at using it. It could be that their tendons are overly protected, like the receptors, the mechanoreceptors in their tendons, the Golgi tendon organs might be overly protective to avoid injuries. The architecture of the muscle tissue might be more frail. You have that in people who don't lift heavy. They might have the volume, but the micro tendon, okay, a muscle fiber doesn't go all the way from one end of the muscle to the other. It's always a series of micro fibers or micro segments connected together by micro tendons, and that makes the fiber. Now, those micro tendons are just like tendons; they can be made stronger. So, if those micro tendons are very strong, the tissue is built to handle heavy lifting, and therefore the body feels safer lifting heavy weights. If someone never trains heavy, those micro tendons might stay very like much weaker, and thus the tissue is just not built to sustain heavy loading. So it's quite possible that he's actually using as much weight as he can, not because uh, of some PEDs artificially built muscle, but just because the muscle architecture or the nervous system are just not where they need to be able to lift heavy weights. So I would say it's a clue. It's a clue, but I would never accuse someone of being on PEDs just because they are weak for their size. Right. 2 years ago, you made a capsule explaining why you don't like stimulants. In fact, I love stimulants, but I hate them because I love them, meaning that they work extremely well, but they backfire extremely hard. Anyway, don't like stimulant. Can you review those? Clarify if plain coffee, tea is the same problem. No, it's not. And provide an alternative. Yeah, uh, coffee and tea is not the same thing. First of all, the caffeine from those beverages and the caffeine from a pill like caffeine anhydrous is different in the body. The caffeine anhydrous, for example, will increase cortisol more than the caffeine from the coffee, the tea, and other such beverages. Uh, Maybe because of all the other stuff that you can actually find in the coffee or the tea, or maybe just because chemically that it's a slightly different molecule than the one we use in pre-workout stimulants or caffeine pills, for example. Okay. Um, no, but coffee. I mean, again, you can abuse coffee and have issues, but a normal coffee drinking use is not going to be the same as using more hardcore stimulants. Now, the worst kind of stimulants are those that directly interact with your beta adrenergic receptors, the receptors that normally bind to your own adrenaline to amp you up. Now, they are great for performance. Don't get me wrong, and that's why many pre-workouts include stuff like ephedrine, synephrine, or other similar compounds, like ephedra, for example, because they target those receptors. Now, at the muscle level, if you attach yourself to those receptors, you increase muscle strength, you increase speed of contraction, you increase muscle tone, so you look harder. If you are binding to the receptors in your brain, you get more motivated, more amped up, more focused, more driven. If you bind those to the receptors in your heart, then your heart rate increases and you contract harder, so you can send more oxygen to the muscles, so endurance also improves. So from a performance standpoint, it works. The problem is that it's such a strong stimulant or binder of the beta receptors that it can actually do the same thing I mentioned earlier with intermittent fasting. It can make the beta adrenergic receptors less responsive to your own natural adrenaline. And when that happens, it typically leads to an over release of cortisol when you're in a stressful situation. Because cortisol, one of the functions of cortisol is to increase adrenaline when you are facing a stressful situation, so that you can face that danger with all the possible physical resources and mental resources you can muster, right? So if you cannot elevate adrenaline enough to stimulate your receptors because the receptors are becoming resistant, then the body will overproduce cortisol in the hope of producing more adrenaline to try to keep amping you up. Okay, so that would be one issue. The other issue would be obviously if you become really, really resistant, then you will become lethargic, you'll become lazy, and you're going to have all kinds of behavioral problems. So it's something that stimulants, like hardcore stimulants, can be used if you need like a top level performance right now. So it's something like if you're testing your 1RM, if you have a powerlifting competition, I could see someone using that. I wouldn't use that in something like Olympic weightlifting because the coordination is a bit too complex. So when you amp yourself up, yeah, you get stronger, you're more powerful, but motor coordination tends to become less effective, less efficient. But certainly for deadlift or squat or bench, it would help. Now, the problem is when you become reliant on that at every single workout. First, because it hides problems in programming. I mean, if you have to use a pre-workout supplement, when I say pre-workout, I mean a stimulant pre-workout, not carbs, electrolytes, and protein. But I'm really talking about just stimulants. If you need to use that to be amped up for your workout, because you're too tired, then your programming likely sucks. You're just doing either too much volume, you don't have enough rest days, you might not have good exercise selection. You need to review your programming. But if you are relying on the band aid to give you energy, you just don't think, well, you know what? I should probably review my program because you don't. That actually doesn't cross your mind because the pre workout allows you to get the workout done, but you're just digging yourself in a deeper and deeper and deeper grave. So these are the issues. Of course, in the long run, it can actually lead to lower testosterone level because the more cortisol you produce, the harder it is to produce testosterone because they are made from the same material, pregnant alone. So the more you produce one, the less you have available to produce the other. So that would be a long-term side effect. Now, I'm a big fan of nootropics. Nootropics are different than stimulants. They are basically are products that will I want to say, optimize your brain chemistry. So the problem is that nootropics are kind of hard to recommend. Now, I could not recommend a specific one for you because each person's brain chemistry requires different things. So for example, if a nootropic works mostly by increasing dopamine level, okay, and you already have high dopamine level, it will not help you. If you have low serotonin, it will be even worse because any supplement or nootropic that increases dopamine production will lower serotonin. So it can actually make you worse. So it's kind of hard to find a product that will fit everyone. I obviously love brain candy. For me, it optimized my brain chemistry because I have low dopamine and fairly low acetylcholine, and it improves both. So for me, I feel amazing on it. I also like no peptide, which works by a different mechanism. It essentially improves the speed of connection in your brain. I really like that. Um, so personally, I stick with those because I know they work for me. Now, other people might actually need different nootropics because your brain might have a different need. You might need to increase GABA, you might need to increase serotonin, you might need to increase uh, dopamine, you might need to increase adrenaline, you might need to increase the duration of adrenaline, you might need to reduce the duration of adrenaline. So there is no one size fits all nootropic, but certainly if you can find the one that works with your brain chemistry, it's a very good option. All right. At what point when exercising and having the heart rate elevated, does it become a point of diminishing return or negative to the heart? For example, a marathon of long duration cardiovascular exercise. I'm going to confess I'm not an expert on endurance training, so it's kind of hard for me to make a good recommendation or answer your question properly because I've never spent a lot of time either training in that zone, training people in that zone, or learning about that zone. Uh, one thing I can tell you is that the more you train in that higher range zone, the higher the stress is. So it, it's it's kind of hard. It's an individual thing. It's about cardiovascular health, not just the heart health, but also the vascular health. If you have lots of plaque in your arteries, that increases the stress on your heart. So if you, for example, if you're an endurance athlete and you have a very elastic heart, okay, typically endurance athletes, especially if they do a lot of foundational work, which would be your typical low intensity steady state cardio, like not necessarily a marathon, but something of that level of intensity, maybe shorter, but you know what I mean. Uh, that will tend to increase the elasticity of the heart, how much it can expand. Now, why is that important? For the same reason why bodybuilders who have cardiac hypertrophy or increasing the size of the heart is actually a drawback. Even though you might think, well, a bigger and stronger heart would have be able to pump more blood. Now, the difference between the heart development of an endurance athlete and someone who either use steroids or just do heavy shit and has high blood pressure and has uh, poor blood circulation, poor blood flow, poor blood flow, high blood pressure, all that stuff makes it harder for the heart to pump blood because there's more resistance in the bloodstream to pump the blood. The heart has to contract harder, and the heart is a muscle. The harder it contracts, the bigger it gets. Now, if you are an endurance athlete, the type of work you're doing, the heart will expand more, stays viable, I call it that, or extensible. Cardiac hypertrophy you get from steroid use or from heavy lifting and poor health Habits like eating tons of fatty foods and processed food and having high blood pressure all the time and having clogged arteries is that it makes the heart thicker but not more expendable. In fact, it expands less because now it's like super thick and super resistant, so it's very hard to expand. It becomes more of a like very hard, like the rubber of a tire instead of the rubber of a balloon. If you want to call it that, that would be a good example. So why is that important? Because the more extensible your heart is, the more your heart can rely on the stretch reflex to produce the blood flow. So if you can actually expand the heart more, the return it's elastic. It's just like the muscle. It's a stretch reflex. It's like so you stretch the band, the rubber band, and it comes back without actually having to contract that hard. So you might have the same amount of force to get the blood out, but most of that force comes from the reflex rather than active contraction, which causes a lot less stress on the heart. And if you have a thicker heart that doesn't expand much, then you have to focus. You have to rely on contracting hard to push that blood out, and that's a lot more stressful on your heart. So that's why it's kind of hard to say that okay, if you go for X amount of time at 160 beats per minute, it's a danger for your heart. Maybe not, because if you are an engine standing with a highly extensible heart, it's probably doable. It's probably something that your body is built for. But if you have the rigid heart, it will cause a lot of strain. So it really depends on variable like atherosclerotic profile. So, do you have plaque in your arteries? Do you have poor venous return? Do you have more stiffer arteries? Do you have less or stiffer or less extensible heart? These all play a big role in how stressful endurance activities are. I'm sorry if I can't be more precise. That's pretty much the breadth of my knowledge on that topic. Opinion on meat and fruit until I can deserve my carbs. 25% body fat. That's basically a derivative of Poliquin's approach. Charles Poliquin used to recommend meat and veggies only, or when I say meat, it's animal flesh and veggies, or animal products and veggies only until you were at something like his own recommendation was like for men 10% body fat that you can start to have carbs. Did you miss? Do you really mean fruits or did you mean veggies? Because if you mean fruit, it just doesn't make sense because fruits have plenty of carbs. So when you can easily get 200, 300 grams of carbs from eating fruits. So certainly meat and fruit would not be a low carb diet. It wouldn't fit what Polycus was saying. And preserving my carbs would make no sense because if you have fruits, you already have carbs. Obviously, it depends on the amount of fruit you mentioned. If you're just thinking about having a serving of berries with your breakfast or and post workout, that's a thing. But if you have 300 grams of carbs from fruit, that's a different thing. So in that case, your question to me doesn't make much sense because fruits are carbs. Let's phrase your question differently so that I can actually give you a usable answer. Is uh, should I wait to be leaner to have a significant amount of carbs? My answer 10 years ago would have been yes, because I was deeply entrenched in politics methods. Now I must say not really. Okay, certainly if you are 25% body fat and your goal is to be leaner, then you obviously need to be in a caloric deficit. So reducing carbs is a pretty good way of being in a caloric deficit because a large amount of our calories daily come from carbohydrates, and they tend to be foods that have a high amount of calories per portion. So a smaller portion will have a higher amount of calories. The size, so that matters. So reducing carbs certainly will lead to a calorie deficit. That doesn't mean taking carbs out completely. In fact, I would recommend against that, especially if you want to be muscular. The main reason is that carbs will help you first perform better in training. They will help you maintain a more stable thyroid level. They will help decrease adrenaline and cortisol after a workout and in the evening. And they will also help you recover from your session by replenishing muscle glycogen. So best results, even if your goal is to lose fat, would be with carbs. Now, the thing is, when do you have your carbs? If your goal is to lose fat, I would limit my carbs to post workout or around the workout and in the evening. And certainly you would lower the amount you're using. And I would include fruits or carbs. So I would have my carbs only directly around the workout, so either just before or just after, and in the evening meal when you're trying to relax. The reason is that carbohydrates can be sedative, so they will help you calm yourself down when you're amped up. So they will lower adrenaline, will lower cortisol. So in the evening, they help you relax and sleep better. Post workout, it helps you get back to a normal state, not keeping your adrenaline high, here, which the drawback that can lead. So I certainly would have carbs around a workout and in the evening. Now, the amount will obviously depend on how much of a deficit you need. You probably need something like 1 to 1.25 grams of protein per pound if you're losing fat. I would keep fat fairly low, probably something like 70, 90 grams, and then the rest would be carbs. So certainly something like 50 grams around the workout of carbs and 50 to 100 grams in the evening would be well. So again, as long as you're in a deficit, it will work. And there are many physiological and psychological and neurological benefits in keeping some carbohydrates in your diet. How much time should, sorry, uh, how much time should a single workout last for weight loss? First of all, okay, lifting should not be the main driver of fat loss. You should never plan your lifting workout with the goal of losing fat. Okay? That's for cardio, that's for overall physical activity. The most important thing I find when it comes to losing fat, besides diet, because that is the number one most important thing, is the amount of background physical activity you have on a daily basis. So the more physically active, I'm not talking exercise. I'm talking about moving as much as possible, doing daily chores, being like walking, mowing the lawn, like as much as possible. That is the cornerstone of losing fat. There was a study done on Amish people, the Amish people who basically live like we lived in the late 1800s or early 1900s. So they found that despite having for the males an average caloric intake of close to 4,000 calories per day, with a significant amount of saturated fat and sugar, they were on average 9% body fat, just because of the amount of physical activity they had during their day. Not hard physical activity, just background being active all the time. That would be the number one thing. You cannot compensate low level of background physical activity by more hard training, because more hard training when you're dieting down is a recipe for disaster. The reason for that is if you're I'm gonna train more, I'm gonna do more volume in the gym to burn more calories. Okay. The problem with that is that you are in a state where you're giving your body less energy and less nutrients. So it will be harder to recover from your workout. And now you're making your workouts bigger. It's even harder to recover from. The main reason why people lose muscle when they're dieting down is not the caloric restriction. It's because they are afraid of losing muscle. Because they're afraid of losing muscle, or because they want to lose fat faster, they just jack up their volume like crazy. That creates more muscle damage. Muscle damage is not a stimulus for muscle growth. It can actually impair muscle growth, because if you cause too much muscle damage and you cannot repair it all, then you will actually lose muscle tissue. So I think it's a mistake to look at the amount of training, lifting you're doing when you as a thing you need to play with when trying to lose fat. Look for increasing cardiovascular training. Look for increasing background physical activity. Look for controlling your diet. The lifting is there to help you keep your muscle. The more muscle you have, the more metabolically active you are, the easier it is to lose fat. Losing muscle is destructive for fat loss goal. Also, the more muscle you have, the more insulin sensitive you are, which also helps you lose fat. Okay? So I certainly would not focus on using a higher volume of work when training for getting leaner. In fact, personally, when I'm training to get leaner for a photo shoot, that's always when my lifting volume is the lowest. I use a very low volume but very high effort. to failure and beyond, but low volume of work. Now you ask about training time. Training time is even less relevant. In fact, training time is one of the stupidest measure of training that you can find. I'm going to give you an example. At the gym I used to work at as a trainer, there were uh, two guys. One was a police officer, one was a fireman, and they literally spent 3 hours and a half for their workout. Their workout lasted 3 hours and a half. I knew because I was there for 8 hours a day training clients. But during that time, they probably did 5 sets, maybe more, but very few sets because they were essentially reading a paper, talking about their weekend, hitting on a girl there. Very, very low amount of volume, but lots of time spent in a building called the gym. So the amount of time you're training has absolutely no relevance. Volume has. I'm going to give you an example. Let's say that you have three different people. One is a CrossFit athlete. The CrossFit athlete will do a WOD lasting 20 minutes. In that 20 minutes, he'll do something like, let's say, 4 rounds, okay, of 20 deadlifts with 225, 20 muscle ups, 20 kibi swings, and 20 clean and jerk, let's say. And in 4 rounds of that, okay? And will like take 20 minutes. Then the power lifter will train and will do something like like 5 warm-up sets on the squat, 2 work sets on the squat, and 3 sets on the systems work, and a little dabbling on here and there. So you train 12 hours and a half because if you're lifting heavy, you need to rest longer between sets. Who has the more volume? The CrossFit athlete has more volume, probably has more adrenaline, more cortisol also. The time spent in the building of the gym has no relevance on physical adaptation. The volume you're doing. And my answer to that is it's a mistake to increase lifting volume when your goal is losing fat. In fact, you should train probably more briefly but harder, but increase background activity and cardiovascular training. Uh, we'll be presenting at Swiss, not this year. I was supposed to, and again, okay, uh, my my head coach, Tom Shepard, who works for me and who co-wrote a book with me, will be presenting. But personally, with two young kids, uh, I try to get out of the house as less as possible. I don't want long trips. In the Swiss, now it's in the US. When it was in Canada, it was a different story because it could fly in and out in the same day. That was pretty easy. Now it's in the US. For me, it's an international flight. So that means longer travel. It means at least one day before, so I can avoid if there's a problem with the flight. And normally, I also leave one day later. So I'm staying there for 4 days instead of one, and that's time I don't want to spend away from my family. So I'm actually decreasing the amount of international trips I'm taking. If I'm doing a seminar, it's going to be something because I have a big seminar with lots of attendees that paying money. That's why it's financially worth it compared to the time I'm losing with my family. So, no, I will not be doing this with. Also, they are somewhat changing the format, which doesn't fit my skill set. Ken, and I love Ken. Ken is a great guy. Um, he wants the presentations to be more practical and theoretical. And he actually was pretty emphatic to me that he did not want theoretical presentation because that's a YouTube video and people will not go to a place to see that. And that's what I do. I do theoretical presentation. Tom is great at presenting in practical sessions. I'm not. So I just didn't feel comfortable and I wouldn't be my best by doing a practical situation presentation. How do you get good at doing 1 to 2 reps in reserve in set? Most of us grossly underestimate how many more reps we can do before hitting failure. Absolutely right. The best way to be good at doing 1 to 2 reps in reserve is spending a decent amount of time training to failure. So that's why I actually love to use a low volume, high effort or effort based training with trainings. Once they have the capacity to train hard enough, because spending 6, 8, 12 weeks going to failure on every work set gives you a lot of practice reaching that point. And that teaches you how failure feels, how 1 rep short of failure feels, how 2 reps short of failure feels, how 3 reps short of failure feels. So once you go back to a more volume-based approach, which uses RIR, and you know what that feels like. You know what 1 rep short of failure feels like, so you are much less likely to underestimate the amount of effort you need to produce in your set. All right. Can you list protein, carbs, and fat foods from experience? What do you mean? I can't answer questions in French. Sorry. Uh, The reason is that I actually want people to keep watching those videos. And if there's like a certain amount of people watching and only one of them speaks French, then the rest of the people will tune out and will leave. So I'm going to answer your question, but in English, if that's fine. So, hi, Christian. If you're training for hypertrophy, why would the training with resistance band be less effective than training with machines and pulley? Thanks for your knowledge. Good question. Actually, I had the exact same question sent to me by someone on Instagram because he just got a job as a trucker, long distance trucker, and he would not have access to a gym, so he bought a resistance band to be training in his truck. Now, you can absolutely get some hypertrophy with bands. The main drawbacks of bands is that it basically neglects the key portion of the range of motion when it comes to muscle growth. So for most exercises or most muscles, loading the tissue while it's in its most lengthened state, okay, is where most of the growth stimulation occurs. So creating tension when the muscle is lengthened is very big part of maximizing growth. Now with resistance band, that portion is always unloaded or underloaded. Let's say that you are doing a loop a band behind your back and you're going to do chest press with a band. Okay, when you are here, the band is stretched, so now there's a lot of tension. But when I'm here, the band is shortened, so there's no tension. Where I need the most tension is where I have the least amount of tension. Now, on some exercises, that works because you're supposed to have less tension in the lengthened position. But for most exercises, it dramatically decreases how effective that movement is. Same thing with a squat. If you're squatting with bands, then the bottom half is essentially non-stimulatory at all because there's no tension, and that's where the quadricep is being lengthened and thus the most prone to growth. So that would be the main drawback from resistance band. The second drawback is it's kind of hard to progressively overload the muscle because you can't really measure how much force you need to apply, how much resistance there is on bands. It's not like with barbells or machines where you can add 5 pounds, remove 5 pounds, and you can adjust the resistance. And as you get stronger, to provide a stronger stimulus, you can add more weight and more weight. With bands, it's kind of hard to do that. You can move to a bigger band, but normally the resistance is exponentially higher than just the 5 or 10 more pounds. So from a progression standpoint, it's much harder. You need to progress by adding reps, which can work, but it just adds volume and volume and volume. So now the biggest benefit of bands is that they cause a lot less muscle damage than regular lifting. So it probably means you can do more volume, you can do more frequency, but it's certainly not as effective as machines, pulleys, or free weights because it underloads the lengthened position. So to be effective, you likely need to do a bit more volume, more frequency, and make sure that you get those sets closer to failure. If you want to make bands more effective, you likely need to take advantage of the growth factor production because growth factors will stimulate anabolism outside of mechanical tension. So sets lasting 40 to 70 seconds, so lots of lactate being built, it burns. That will lead to growth factor, and that can make the set a bit more effective considering the lack of mechanical tension. So it's an imperfect tool, but it can work if you don't have access to anything else. Opinion on meat and nut breakfast still viable in 2022 based on new data. Well, there's not really, it's not that there's new data. You need to understand what it does. I personally like it. I mean, I believe that the breakfast should be protein dominant, and I believe in low carbs breakfast. I think that amps you up better. Because when you think about it, was what do you need for certain parts of the day? And the nutrition for that portion of the day should fit what you need to be, what state you need to be in. So proteins and fats will not be sedative. It actually will likely amp you up a bit. So as your first meal of the day, that could be a good thing because it can keep you awake. Whereas if you have a high amount of carbs, it could actually have a sedative effect, making it harder to wake up. That's why people will need a bunch of coffee with their high carbs breakfast. So personally, I like carbs when I need my brain to calm down. So that would be after a workout. That would be after a presentation. That would be after doing a podcast. That would be before sleeping. And the rest of the time, especially if my goal is to get leaner, I will go low carbs on these meals to keep my brain active. So it's really more about what you need to accomplish. Armor 52, well, you can just read the article. Uh, what are the best foods aside from red meat to help boost dopamine? That's the thing. The thing that will boost dopamine the most are essentially what gives you the most pleasure. Like chocolate will give you a lot of dopamine. But I would not recommend eating tons of chocolate or sugary treat just to get a dopamine effect because dopamine it's essentially a pleasure neurotransmitter. So anything that gives you pleasure will boost your dopamine. But is do you really want to feed yourself crap just so that you can have a dopamine? Probably not. Probably not. Okay, so sorry, I don't answer injury questions. I'm nobody a doctor muscle being pulled. Uh, okay, I'm still gonna answer because I actually had that exact injury. Okay, so normally I don't answer injury related questions because it's not my area of expertise. It's not my field. And I normally refer people out, and I feel it's irresponsible, especially when not knowing the person's case precisely. Like you mentioned, pulled adductor muscle while squatting heavy, and that's pretty much something that happened to me. Although I didn't pull it while squatting, I pulled it while shuffling snow and slipping on the ice. But I couldn't squat after that. I could squat light, but I just couldn't full squat heavy because the adductors are mostly active during the bottom half part of the squat. So what I found was that deadlift, especially with narrow stance, worked really well. So that was good. So I did that. I really focused on my deadlift rather than squat at that time, and I would use like half squats, so the 90 degrees parallel, that or going the lowest I can go. So going from 90 degrees, or mostly using box squats or high box squat, allowed me to keep training the squatting pattern, and maybe over time lower the box so that you can gradually increase range of motion as your adductors are healing. But really be wary about speeding up, going back to full squatting too soon. Because one thing I noticed is that even if your adductors feel good in quarter squats or half squats, and you don't feel them when walking, they are extremely long to heal. And just one set of heavy squat can actually repull the muscle. So I would probably focus on deadlift as a big lift. I would do, if you want to keep squatting, I would do box squat probably to 90 degrees to start, and then maybe go a bit lower as you're getting more comfortable. I would certainly focus more on things like a leg press with a narrow stance. That would actually be good, and leg extension if you have excess blood machine to maintain that muscle mass. You can also do backwards sled drags, which can actually help with the quad, but also the adductor. All right. Do you know how much glycogen per area? For example, if you're fully replenished and works leg like 3 days in a row, do you have empty leg stores and full body stores? Not probably not because you're probably eating carbs, right? Uh, I don't know the exact amount. For example, like someone who's like 200 pounds, 200-pound male who's fairly muscular can probably store between 400 and 600 grams of glycogen overall, so in all of his muscles. So how much is that for each muscle? I don't know, but you can probably figure that out pretty precisely. Uh, but again, yes, if you are training legs, you will use glycogen primarily from the muscles being trained, absolutely. But it's a lot less than you think you are. You're not. using tons and tons and tons of glycogen. It's not like if you have 200 grams of glycogen in your legs. It's not like when you are doing a leg workout, it will deplete glycogen completely. You're probably going to be using something like 50 to 60 grams. So it's very easy to replenish that by eating even a moderate amount of carbs uh, after the workout throughout the day. I heard that fasting helps with longevity. Well, it really makes a big difference, makes me live longer and makes me feel young, or it's just a very small difference. Um, it's not fasting, it's caloric restriction. The scientific data shows that being in like people who eat less live longer. So there is benefit there, mostly because of the enzyme called AMPK, which can be pro longevity. Okay, so there is an impact. Uh, is fasting better? It depends. You do get plenty of AMPK, but if you eat tons of crabs afterwards, it might not be worth it. Uh, Personally, it's not something I would recommend. I would just avoid huge influx of food. But again, longevity is all about maximizing NPK. So cardiovascular exercise, more background physical activity, like I mentioned earlier, are keys, and not stuffing yourself. So less calories will lead to more longevity, which might not be productive to your other goal, which might be to be more muscular. Okay, so you need to consider what is the most important for you. But it does make a difference, but it's not like it's going to add 20 years to your life. Please, could you give me some guidance on how much to increase volume with age as percent increase over 50? Why? If there's anything, I would probably think you need less volume as you're getting older. Actually, not older, but experienced. Why? Because if you've been lifting for 20, 30 years, you're better at lifting. You're more efficient at lifting. So, neurologically speaking, you are better at recruiting motor units. You're better at making each step more effective. You're probably better at pushing each step. You're also probably stronger if you've been training for 30 years than when you started out. So each set actually causes a more stressful, a bigger stress on the joints, on the ligament, on the tendons, because yeah, the muscles are stronger too, but the tendons, the fascia, the bones are not that much stronger. So the added weight can actually cause more stress. So I think it's a big misunderstanding that more advanced or older lifters need more volume. I think they need less. I think that intermediate lifters might need more, but as you're getting stronger and more neurologically efficient, you can do the same amount of stimulation with less volume. I would personally, the volume I'm doing right now at 47 it is literally at least, I would say, less than half of what I was doing at my peak. And my strength is still going up. Have you experienced athletes that struggle to put size on their dominant arm? Yes. But the other arm grows more easily? Yes. Should they increase hypertrophy volume for non-dominant arm? Maybe. Okay, that's actually pretty common. Dr. Ellington Darden wrote about that. That when you are more efficient with a side, in the trainability of that side might be lower because you're just more efficient at doing physical work. Okay, so but just look at without looking at dominant non-dominant size arms. I would just look at one side lagging behind the other. Well, there are some strategies to be that are effective. However, consider this: none of these strategies will fix the problem soon enough for you. Meaning that don't expect I'm going to apply one of these strategies, and within a month it's going to be fixing the issue. Look at it this way: a non-beginner can hope to add maybe 1 to 1.5 pounds of muscle per month. That would be actually a very good year. That would be 12 to 20 pounds of muscle per year. For a non-beginner, that's absolutely humongous. So in reality, you're probably going to be gaining more like zero point 0.5 to 1 pound per month. Okay, so and that's for the whole body. The whole body. Let's say you want to increase the size of your left bicep because it's lagging behind the right. How much muscle is there really on the left bicep? compared to the rest of the body. So if I'm building 1 pound of muscle with my whole body, how much is on my bicep? 0.01, or maybe like, let's say 100 grams, something like that. It will take a very long time to build enough additional tissue on the weaker side to balance it out. It's not something that will be fixed in a month, not even in 3 months, probably more something like a year. It sucks to hear, but that's just physiology. Okay, if you're gonna have muscle over your whole body, there's only a small proportion that can go to a specific muscle. So to make that muscle not only grow but grow more than the other side, it's gonna take a long time to see a visual difference. That doesn't mean the techniques are not working. You just need to give it time. Okay. So one strategy you can use. First, it would be the one I prefer is uh, follow the leader. Follow the leader, which would be my first, try to use as many unilateral exercises as possible because you can easily compensate with one side, with your dominant side. And for example, you start with your dominant side, let's say you do 10 reps. Well, you want to do 10 reps with the other side. So if you can reach 8, you're going to rest for 15 seconds and do 2 more. That will be the first basic strategy. The other strategy that I personally recommend using is simply doing 2 or 3 more sets for the weaker side. It's simple. It doesn't have to be overly complicated. It's just a matter of these techniques take time to work. It takes 6 months, a year to see a visual difference. So it's not a technique that is not working. It's that you probably are not waiting long enough to see it work. Can one develop aerobic capacity and the ability to handle lactate in the same training cycle? Probably. The capacity to handle lactate is mostly a matter of reducing the central fatigue that comes from the lactate buildup. The central fatigue, as you probably know, because I talk about it a lot, and well, does Paul Carter and other guys like that, it is a weakening of the neural drive from the nervous system to the muscle. It just becomes weaker. And the weaker the signal is, the harder it is to recruit the fast twitch fibers, and the harder it is to create a forceful and rapid contraction and a coordinated contraction. Okay? So, and the main thing that causes central fatigue are uh, information sent from the muscle, from the tendon, from whatever to the nervous system that what you are doing is so hard, it can be dangerous. So pain signals, discomfort signal, feeling of effort, all send information to your brain that can create an inhibition of the nervous system, which will lead to central fatigue. And that's simply a protective mechanism to avoid doing something that is seen as hazardous for too long. Okay, so lactate building workout. So it's not the lactate, it's the hydrogen ion that causes the burn, but it's still the same. So the burn that you feel when you're doing that type of training sends a lot of information to your brain that inhibits the contraction. So the key is simply to spend more time in that zone. The more time you spend in that zone, the more you can desensitize yourself. So you still get the pain, you still get the signal, but your brain, because now it's something that is common that you often have to do, the body becomes desensitized to the information. It's kind of like if you work in a factory. The first week you get there, it's super noisy and it creates tons of fatigue. You're burned out. It's very aggressive. After a month or two, the noise is still there, but it doesn't cause the same fatigue because your brain becomes inhibited, becomes desensitized to those warning signals. So yeah, you can do that by being frequent, trading frequently in that lactate zone. I've seen that in a CrossFit athlete I've worked with. Her problem was the lactate zone, the lactic zone. She was extremely very strong, she was powerful, and she had pretty good endurance, but her lactic tolerance was extremely bad. So her had her do tons of lactate work, mostly there, and it improved dramatically. The problem is you need to understand that lactic work is one of the most draining type of training you can do. So for example, if you have a lactic workout on Monday, it's likely going to negatively impact a strength workout being done the next day. So you need to program accordingly. When will you release the new neurotyping course? I don't know. Right now, I'm still working on upgrading the hypertrophy course. Neurotyping is next. It's actually done. The material is produced. I actually gave the seminar once in English, so I do have the material. It's just a matter of filming it. So I honestly would probably expect it by, let's say, March, something like that. How should endomorphs conduct a bulking cycle? You should probably not do a bulking cycle. I don't really believe in bulking anyway. It's you cannot force your body. And there was a study. I think Meadow Instrument posted it. They show that a caloric surplus, a large caloric surplus, did not lead to a higher amount of muscle growth than a smaller caloric surplus. So yes, food is anabolic, but there's a point where just overconsumption will not help you put on further muscle. It will help you build more fat, gain more water, but it's actually not muscle itself. Especially in the case of an endomorph who is naturally skilled at piling on body fat. So I certainly would not go on a bulking cycle in the way people think it is. I would probably go with a mild caloric surplus. Also, depending on the person, it is fat or not. Fatter individuals don't need to be in a caloric surplus to build muscle. Whereas the leaner you are, the more you need to be in that surplus. So you probably just should focus on having a mild surplus for the week and maybe cycling so you have days of surplus and maintenance. Uh, it'd be neat to chat. Um, I'm gonna have a last one because it's been what, an hour and 6 minutes, which is already way too long. Congratulations for not being asleep for that time, by the way. Okay, so if a loaded dip with an elastic band with resistance is 10 kilos in the down of the movement and 15 at the top, will have the same benefit as loaded with 10 kilos dumbbell. No, it will not. Well, first of all, I mean, I don't think your example is good because I don't think the resistance band. Okay, first of all, in the bottom, a loaded dips with a resisting band. But how do you have resistance to a dip? How do you do that? Because the way I see it, you're using the band to help you out on a dip. But let's forget about the dip for a second. First, most resistance band will not provide such a small difference between lengthen and shorten. From experience, okay, with most resistance band, when you are in the bottom position, there's no tension. Not just 5 kilos less than at the top. So if I'm doing a chest press with a band, here I have maximum resistance. Here it's zero resistance, unless it's a very, very short band. Okay, but most bands I've used, which are something like 3 feet in length, if I'm correct, in the bottom position of pretty much every exercise, there's just no tension. There's no tension. So you can probably set them up to have some tension, but the difference will be a lot more than that. So there's just no way to make resistance exercise as effective as other type of resistance. I'd like it to be that effective because when I travel, I just would have to carry bands, and I like bands, but physiologically, it just is not an optimal method. It will completely, even a tricep extension with a range of motion is not that long. At the top, attach a band at the top. Okay? Here, you have no tension. You have literally zero tension, and here you have a lot of tension. If you adjust it so that there's tension at the top, you probably won't be able to go all the way down. So no, it's plus the fact that you can properly structure your progression. It's an inferior training tool, regardless of how you want to turn it and look at it and do mental gymnastics to convince yourself it's good. It's okay. If you have no other choices, if, for example, we go on lockdown again, you don't have a gym, you can probably maintain your physique and get some gains with bands only training, but it will never be as effective as resistance training with other tools. All right, guys. Even more questions than last week. So you guys are getting better and better by the week. So hopefully you are also there next week and are even better. So until then, have a good week and see you next Thursday. Tell your friends.